Hi, welcome to Faster Forward. Joining me this time, all the way from Eastern Australia, is the award winning artist and writer, Kathleen Jennings. Kathleen, welcome to Fast Forward.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here and to see you.
I know it's been ages, but I've been saying that to everybody we've had on. Nobody sees anybody, and I miss it. I miss hanging out with everyone.
I know.
Yeah, so let's start with how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been a year, but I think it's been fairly. We've got away with a lot. I think in Brisbane, in Queensland, and I know we're a lot better off than a lot of people have been. And it's getting to that time of year now where I think we're working out how to cope, how to make things,
Yeah.
how to talk to everyone again. So yeah, how are you going?
Doing good, doing good. Not going out a lot, wearing our masks, washing our damn hands. You know,
All those good
what is our
things,
new normal? So,
definitely.
how has the pandemic affected things where you are?
So Australia has been, I think, relatively protected just by distance. We've had some quite bad uh, outbreaks in areas, and Victoria is really struggling at the moment. But where I am, pretty much just lockdown and then the slowdown, and I do some lecturing at the university and tutoring at the university. So a lot of learning to very quickly adapt on the fly in person creativity and writing classes to online. But otherwise, I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
personally. I thought I didn't personally leave the house a whole lot, given that I write and draw. It turns out I left the house an awful lot. So I've had to adjust and adjusting to not being on the road for a month or two every year and
Yeah.
working out that that is why other people use weekends to not work.
So you are one of the people that has had a new book coming out during the pandemic, and that
Yes.
can't have been fun.
It was definitely a bit uh, worrying, disappointing to begin with when everything was kicking off, but because my book wasn't coming out until the end of July, um, there was time, I think, to adjust. It's been like the rolling nature of this year has not been great for anyone, but in terms of gradually adapting to disappointments, it's been a mercy in some ways. So by the time it got to July, I'd accustomed myself to the idea. Even when it looked like maybe things would open up again, there'd always be someone coming across the border from New South Wales or wherever, and suddenly there'd be a panic. And it was always at the hardware store just across the highway from me that people would show up infectious. So I was like, oh, okay, I can't. It would have been nice to have had an in-person event, but it was never an option. And I had the benefit of all the, I suppose, pioneers of online book launches for the previous 5 months had the benefit of watching what they did. And there was, it was really nice because so many people were online, because so many events and sessions and salons had switched to online. I could see a lot more people, even if remotely, and talk to a lot more readers than I otherwise could have if I'd been, I think, on the road or just going to bookstores that I could get to. So that was really lovely. So in the end, it wasn't too bad. It was so late along that I couldn't be disappointed about it, and far enough along that I think people could concentrate on books again, which was
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. And we'll talk about the book Fly Away in just a bit, but I want to talk a little bit first about your art because that's how I first knew you. I think we first met at the World Fantasy in 2014 here in DC, where
Yes,
my wife and I ran the art show and you were in it. And I remember getting blown away by your art, which I think you sold all of it.
I think it did go pretty well that year.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was
And
that
I
was a great year.
remember watching you sketching. That's what I remember is watching you sketching, and your sketches are amazing.
Thank you
You
very
capture
much.
so much in just a few lines. Just blows me away, and it's so different from your other art. You do these silhouettes. If you show the cover of Fly Away, your book, because you did
I'll
the
show you
cover.
the Both covers. That's the ARC, because
Yeah,
Postal Services have not given me the American one yet, and that's the Australian cover. So it's
and if
both
you
the same
can't
silhouette.
tell, those are all silhouette cut paper, cut out paper, and that must take incredible discipline, and it has to be very controlled.
I
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, controlled, yes. I work with the knife working around my fingernail a lot. So people always ask me if I've cut myself with the knife. I'm like, no, I just usually trim my fingernails really closely, sharpen them. Except the other day I put a new blade on the knife and then just sort of patted it on the head. I'm not sure why. It's probably not being allowed out enough. It's like, you don't do that with a new knife.
Did it bite you?
It did. And I had a very large thing to cut out immediately afterwards, and it's my index finger. So. But yeah,
But
there is a big difference between the two styles. So
yeah,
I definitely personally see how they feed into each other, but on the page they look very different.
they do. Well, what is the similarity? I don't see because I'm not an artist. So
I
to
think
me, they look very different.
for me, it's largely the communication aspect of it. I like illustration that's telling a story, which for me means that it's in motion, like sharks. Stories have to keep moving, and that sense of you can do. I love highly rendered art, and I don't do it. One of the things I like about writing is I can get more painterly than I do with my own illustrations. But being able to convey something in a telling detail or a few lines or just a sense of movement and how much of a story you can get across in that way or how much of a personality is something I really like and particularly enjoy working on with the sketchbook, which is the one you saw me working in, is what I tend to take when I travel instead of a camera. There's only a few things I actually take photographs when I travel, just mostly historically significant trees and ancient English styles, because it was just very exciting when I saw my first style. It was just like something out of the famous five. And that ability and practice in communicating something very quickly pays off in the silhouettes, because even though they're very detailed and there's a lot of fine work in them, they're not actually detailed because it is like essentially what's left when you take all the detail out of a picture, and it again is the shape and the movement and the way the space is filled that conveys the story. So I see that communication
Yeah,
going back and forth, and also things like sword fighting. If I'm having people fencing in an illustration, I can really go for the accuracy of the details, or I can go for the accuracy of the sense of energy. And for some reason, there's a lot of my sketchbooks people pick up and think I'm just making stuff up. It's like, no, I just seem to end up at a lot of fencing competitions as an observer, weirdly, or reenactments, or there'll be people running around with swords before Shakespeare in the park. And
yeah.
having that vocabulary in the back of your
And
head, or being used to making those lines, pays off in a lot of different styles.
I noticed the sword fighting stuff because you did the illustrations for Tremontaine,
Yes.
the serialized sword point prequel that Ellen Kushner and a bunch of other people did. That and you did all the illustrations for it.
I
It's
really enjoyed
really
doing that. And they really gave me a real boost, along with the awareness of the silhouettes style, but also with my opportunity to experiment with a lot of different stories to tell, because I was doing a silhouette for every episode for the first 2 seasons, and the encouragement of that was very useful. So some of the first silhouette illustrations I did were for an art show in Brisbane a number of years back now, and I brought some of those over to the early World Fantasies that I got to, which was, I think, 2012, 2014, and Ellen and co saw those. So I've been developing on those ever since.
I was getting a little drop out there,
You're
so
back now.
that may be me. Yeah, that may be me. Um, so you're an artist and a writer. Did one of them come first? Did you always write and draw, or did the writing come out of the art?
I always wrote and drew, just as a matter of course, but I always imagined that I'd be a writer first, at least when I was smaller. I think a lot of the, excuse me, a lot of the illustrations that I was seeing formed so much a part of the story that for a while I wasn't aware of illustrations as a separate thing to a story. When I was really small, the first author whose illustrations I really became aware of was Pauline Baynes. You can see some Narnia books behind me, but particularly her Farmer Giles of Ham illustrations. And then, but always assumed writing, and I'd try and get a government job to support me while I worked on the writing, and then did law accidentally, and then accidentally got a job as a lawyer, and then spent a number of years trying to stop being a lawyer. And along the way was trying to work out which of my many fascinations I could do, would do, and wanted to do every day. So I was living in a share house with 5 other people. It was a wooden share house. I was a young lawyer, so I was getting home at 1 a.m. And with the best will in the world, I could not practice the bagpipes every day, but I could draw every day. And I was actually learning the bagpipes at the time. I could draw every day, and I was doing weekly illustration challenges and putting those online. And eventually people were seeing those, and I started getting, my very first book cover was for Small Beer Press for Cloud and Ashes by Greer Gelman through that. And I think it's just a lot easier to show people work in progress when you're an artist than when you're a writer, and for people to see your development. And as the person making it, it's very gratifying to get feedback that quickly. So the illustration really took off. And I've always been writing in the background and publishing short stories. So both, but at different speeds.
Well, let's move to the writing a little bit. One of the things I noticed on your blog was that you started doing an observation journal, which is
Yes.
obviously fairly new for you.
Yes.
And that's very interesting, the way that you have that worked out. And this came out of, I think, from something you were doing with your teaching.
Yes, there was a new subject at the University of Queensland on creativity, myths, methods, and impact. And I was doing the tutorial design for that. One of the pieces of assessment which was built into the course to start with was an observation journal, but I had to work out what that meant. So I was playing around a lot with the concept, trying to come up with something that I could mark and get away with within the university's system, but also which I hoped would be useful for the students, either immediately or if they continued doing it, and practical, and have a lot of flexibility according to what field they were in, whether it was app design or music or plant garden layouts or whatever. So I was playing around with that, working through a few approaches, and ended up adapting a little bit of one of Linda Barry's writing exercises from her book Syllabus, which is great, which was just each day going through and noting 5 things you've seen, 5 things you've heard, 5 things you've done, and a picture, which can be a chart or a diagram or a mud map, or how you got from A to B. It doesn't have to be art. And then on the other page, doing some form of creative exercise with a little bit of reflection on the exercise. So with the students, it could be lifting interview questions out of the interviews with various creators that we showed them and answering them from their own perspective, or it could be grabbing a few things at random from the observation page and trying to come up with a new invention that would address all of those. So one of the class exercises we did with that ended up, I can't remember what the 3 observations were, but they ended up coming up as a class with the idea of teleportation gates for dog walkers so that you could take people's dogs on more interesting walks, and then actually getting them to build up a pitch around that and deal with all the possible issues was a lot of fun. But personally, it's been incredibly useful and interesting, and a way to capture things that I did anyway, sketches, working through ideas, trying out new ways of getting ideas, tinkering with things, but actually having them in one place, having the time to reflect and build on them, follow fascinations, add a little bit of color to the pages, play around with ideas, and it's developed in a lot of different ways and projects since then. So I've been going through gradually putting individual pages up on the blog and talking through some of the exercises that I did and how I think they could be adapted.
And that's fascinating because your blog is, well, there it is. Kathy just put it up for us. That's where your blog is, which is wonderful. And the stuff I was reading with this observation journal were just fascinating. The way it works and the way you have been using it.
Thank
So
you.
let's talk a little bit about Fly Away. That's your new book,
Yes,
your
it is.
novella, and I loved it. Just blew
Thank
me
you.
away. And I think I'd said online that it reminded me in some ways of your art.
Tell me
And
more.
and I'm trying to think of why that is. And I was thinking about it, and the structure of it is very. I really like that because it has the narrative that goes through, but then it jumps off with these kind of interwoven stories that are like fairy tales tied to these kind of peripheral characters or some of the main characters that go off. And at first you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with it? But it's illustrating stuff you need to know about the place and the landscape and all that. So it's got the structure that's there from your silhouettes, but the language is like your sketches. It's very free and open and evocative. And
Thank you so
I've
much.
never been to Australia, never been to Western Queensland, but I felt like I have because your
Oh, wonderful.
descriptions were so good. Um, does that come from your art? Did you do? I think you said you did sketches because you grew up in Western Queensland.
I did. So I grew up on a cattle property out quite west from Brisbane, just Western Queensland, if you're getting really particular about where the outback starts. So technically, we were in Western Queensland, but cattle property, and I did a lot of my schooling by School of the Air with the Royal Flying Doctor Radio, School for Remote Kids. And where was I going with that? So trying to capture that as I experienced it was a large part. And I'm really glad it felt like you were there because there was a particular experience of Western Queensland I had, which was probably largely from growing up on the books I was reading out there, where I could see that it was very beautiful, but that didn't come across in a lot of the books about it that I was reading. And I wanted to play with that. So when I actually went back to university to do an MPhil, which is like a half-size PhD, I'm now starting a full-size PhD, it was on visual evocation of the beautiful sublime in Australian Gothic literature, because there are a number of authors who do really bring out the beauty of it. And I wanted to specifically look at that and look at the how to do those visuals and coming at it as an illustrator, how to deal with light and texture. And when I went back out and was taking notes, it was very much they were written notes, but they were visual notes. And there were scenes where I would sort of key into a particular painting. It's a Tom Roberts painting called The Breakaway. It's got this beautiful powdery light, dusty light in it. And there was one scene where I was trying to evoke that light, but I didn't think the character would be familiar with the painting. So it was that really work of trying to, and this is an exercise I do with one of the lectures I do at uni, getting people to novelize a picture in a way.
Ah, that explains a good bit.
But I really like what you said about those sub stories, even though they all tie into the plot, being illustrative, because I don't know if I thought it through explicitly that way, but I love marginalia. I love things happening in the edges of illustration. Something I love about Pauline Baynes is that there's little inset illustrations of entire scenes. And as an illustrator, I love drawing all over other people's books and essentially commenting on them.
And you mentioned Australian Gothic, which is what I've heard the book described as. It was not a term I was familiar with, but it kind of fits. I think there's horror in it. It's not the most pleasant book. You know what I mean? And I mean that in a good way. But it's got a lot of folklore in it. There's fairy tales, and it's Australian folklore, which I wasn't familiar with. And I love books that take me places I haven't been, and this kind of did that. The the folklore that was in it, is that traditional Australian folklore, or where did all that come from?
So a lot of it is, as you correctly identified, from fairy tales. But again, that experience of growing up in Western Queensland, reading fairy tales, which are from a very different landscape. One of the great things about travel is then getting to go to places where those stories actually belong to the landscape and seeing what they're meant to look like, as opposed to how they kind of grow out of control in Australia. So a lot of it is essentially taking some of the fascinations of fairy tale and seeing what happens if you actually expose them to the Australian climate. Some of it is, there's hints at various stories that were told out where I grew up, and I think everywhere in Australia, probably everywhere has legends of mysterious large black cats flitting through the trees. And
Bone horse.
but a lot of it I just made up, but made up from, I get from the bones of other stories, from the hints of other legends, from what happens to stories. There's bits of it which, the School in the Wilderness story, there's a couple clear fairy tales that underpin that, but there's also a lot of not even folklore, but memory and current history around introduced plant species, particularly lantana, which is more of a coastal problem, and the prickly pear, which just wreaked havoc across a lot of Queensland, and millions of hectares rendered unusable, and would push floorboards up, which I think is a line I used to get under houses and push the floorboards up. And the efforts to control that once it was introduced.
They didn't have Daryl.
They didn't have Daryl. But the guy I meant...
little part of it too, because that was very Pied Pipery.
Pied Piper and Sleeping Beauty, and I tried never to do direct fairy tale retellings because I wasn't wanting to do a particular fairy tale, but I loved, for each of the stories in there that you recognize fairy tale elements for, there's 3 or 4 that I've gathered. So I'm like, well, what if I do, yes, obviously this is going to suggest bits of Little Red Riding Hood, but I want to put some Tamlin in there as well. And I want to put in a story a neighbor told about someone who got washed up in a creek bed, and all of these things. And a Judith Wright poem.
One of the things in the book is it's a lot about secrets and lies and control. Kind of runs through a lot of it, and you find out, it's one of the parts of it that is really horror, is what you find out from the beginning of the book till you get like partway into it about Bettina Scott and what's been going on with her. And it just, when you started finding out what had been going on, it just gave me chills. It was like, oh my God, it's not what I thought. Yeah. You nasty writers, you. Now, was that something that you built in from the beginning? Was that one of the seeds of the book? Or did that build as you were writing it?
So it was definitely one of the seeds. The book began as a few ideas which were really looking like short stories, and then I gradually worked out how they were all connected. So the through line of the story always had that basic idea of what you discover about Bettina, but also what Bettina discovers about herself, and about the world. And that's an approach I very much like, is just starting a book where everything seems fine, and then gradually realizing that maybe it isn't the way you thought. And we've mentioned before, I quite like Diana Wynne Jones, and something I really like about a lot of her books is that sense you have of being like in a lazy spiral, and the story happens and it's very interesting and stuff keeps going on, but you can't quite see how it's all related. And then the story starts, and then there's more and more magic, and then at some point you realize the spiral's getting tighter, but everything has always been relevant. And it's a structure or an approach that I love, and I like that feeling of gradually being immersed into a story and a world as well.
Yeah, and those kind of offshoot stories in it, I'm not sure what to call them, what the term is, but those do that. They build that kind of world that the story is taking place in of Western Queensland, it builds that world slowly, and it gives you a little different incremental look into this part of it and that part of it, and that's really fascinating. And I understand from reading, I guess, your blog that working on Flyaway affected the way did your art.
Yes, and particularly the art for the book itself, because usually, as I mentioned, I love a sense of motion and story in illustration, and I like expanding on a book or ornamenting it, or just having, not ornamenting, but expanding on it, or having fun, or adding little interpretations. But I was putting so much of that into the writing and then into the dissertation that I needed to write alongside it, that all of that academic and narrative impetus was getting absorbed by the book itself. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And in the end, I started to pull back and really lean into something that was fairly ornamental, but also there's a lot of individual birds in it, but all of the chapter illustrations, and I'm not going to be able to open to one now, all of the individual significant illustrations fit a square. So I was putting those sorts of limits on it to, let's see if you can see. So all of those main illustrations fit a square, as well as the front cover. And putting those limitations on it, and then working to try and capture the feeling of the story and to enhance what I was doing, and the way that silhouettes lean into the obvious fairy tale connections, because it's such a traditional way of illustrating them, but the Gothic side as well. And it started to become a lot of fun. I've developed a new appreciation for ornamental illustrations and what they can do, and the way I can go, oh, here's just something a little thematic, not to tell you what you're going to get, but just to get you in the right frame of mind for it.
Yeah. Now, you primarily worked on short fiction, because Flyaway is a novella, and you've done short fiction, short stories. One of them a couple I might want to bring up. One is Undying Love, and that ties into Flyaway because it's kind of in the same world, the Flyaway verse, I guess. Because it's got the same family as one of the major characters as Gary. It's got the Namsons in it, and a different one that are about boundaries and protection and things like that of the cryptozoology in the area.
Yes.
And because I read Flyaway first, and then I picked up Undying Love and started reading it, and went, wait a minute, that name is familiar. So was that on purpose? Was that something you wanted to explore about that family, or was it just, what brought that about?
So I wrote Undying Love a number of years ago, and then Tor.com reprinted it, which was lovely because of their connection to Flyaway. I think that, so I mentioned I studied law, and I enjoyed it, and then I did property law, and that was the subject that suddenly made it all very real to me, because growing up in the country, boundaries and rights of way and easements and adjustments aren't theoretical. It's very much a part of life, plus all of the other land issues that we have in Australia, and with terra nullius and everything else. So it's a very vivid part of Australian history and tradition. So it was fairly natural that would come out. And the idea, once you start playing with introduced species, which both the story and the book do, it immediately also brings up some other Australian history of the dingo fence and the rabbit-proof fence, varying degrees of efficacy. And that idea of people putting boundaries in place, or trying to at least moderate the influence of introduced plant and animal species. So Undying Love is much more concerned, I think, with animals or animal-like introduced folklore, where it's the plants in Flyaway. And I really like that idea of people who don't entirely know what they are doing, are trying to do good, are kind of making it up as they go along, but are possibly also part of the problem. And so when I was working on Flyaway and playing around with the different characters and who they should be, it just felt very clear that although Gary's character is, I think, in a much further out situation, a much more problematic situation than the one Tori in Flyaway is in, who's possibly a distant cousin. They're both coming from families that have more of the full story than some people do, but not all of it, and have ideas about what their family's role is, though they aren't perhaps as fully examined as they could be. But they're both characters who are at a stage of trying to work out what their role is, both in their family and the world. And it's a character and a situation that I quite enjoy writing, not making someone like a character who looks good and then suddenly turning out that they maybe have a questionable past or something, which is a thoroughly enjoyable trope, but just that idea of people muddling along with the information they have, occasional moments of willful ignorance, occasional moments of trying to do better. And it can be quite a lot of fun to roll through a world accompanying a character like that.
Yeah, yeah. The other story I wanted to mention was The Heart of Owl Abbas. Abbas?
I say Owl Abbas, but it sort of depends on where the emphasis needs to fall in a given sentence.
There were the language in that was beautiful. The descriptions, the way that flowed, I just pulled me along. I really found it fascinating. But there were a couple of phrases and words in there. One is saying that a ghost is animate nostalgia. And I went, wow, yeah.
Thank you.
And the other was that where you talked about where things were paved with cobble skulls, which was, you could see that. You could see this like street where the stones were skulls, and it fit in that city.
Thank you.
And the way that went. So that was like very cool stuff. And before we're done, let's talk about your brand new book that's coming out sometime, October?
12th of October. So just almost a month.
Yeah, it's called Travelogues, Vignettes from Trains in Motion. And it's from what I can understand, it's a very different kind of book.
It is, although it comes from some overlapping narrative urges, I think. So basically, it's more or less, we'll call it a book of poetry, a book of 9 poems, which began as me on trains going usually between like New York and Massachusetts, or Baltimore and New York, or London and Exeter on various trips. I can't concentrate on trains. I just have to keep looking out the windows. And once I got Wi-Fi, on trains, I just decided to tweet what I was seeing. And it became this process of trying to work out, essentially a sketchbook, what lines to use to suggest what I was seeing. It's just a written line instead of a drawn line. And that process of going over, like when you sketch and you go over things multiple times, just trying to get the shape right, trying to find the right word, trying to find the best metaphor, and then that happening over about 3 years. So there's points in it where I come back to try and, you can see I'm trying to solve the same problem from a slightly different angle. But part of it is I love fairy tales and folklore, but I also love so many aspects of the built world. I worked for the Department of Transport and Main Roads for a number of years. It was just really interesting. And I like machinery. I love early aviation history. It's something I spend a lot of time reading about because nothing rests on me retaining any accurate details. It's great. Can usually find someone to tell me about it at a party. And way back, I did my honours dissertation on the role of the railway in British children's novels. But while I enjoy, and I can see from where I am, a few books on how railways work and things like that, I'm interested in the mechanical side of it, but I'm primarily interested in the romance of the mechanical side of it, the way early aviation experimenters write about that feeling of being like caught up in a gust or fighting against the wind, and the way stories use trains as these points of mystery, as ways through the world, but also as this bubble of time, and the way machinery affects time and story. So part of the editing process with Flyaway for me was going through, whenever there's a description of machinery, it's very easy to use unpleasant descriptions and just going through and trying to modulate that occasionally. Whereas with travelogues, there is a lot of the words that I'd usually use for a completely self-indulgent fantasy fairy tale style of writing, trying to work out how to use those about delivery vans going along the road beside the train, or about the graffiti on a cutting, and just working through a lot of that. And when you mentioned Al Abbas, out of Al Abbas, a lot of that too is that sense of how much of a story can I make just by tinkering with materials and technology and industry, and doing something that's, in that case, it's not, I don't think it's steampunk, it's definitely adjacent, but that sense of a romance of machinery. Whereas in travelogues, it's bringing that very much back into the world. I'm not making anything up in that. It is literally things I saw out the window, but playing with that idea that they can be as much a site of mystery and romance and adventure and enchantment, if you look at them through a certain lens, as anything wholly invented can be. And so I'm really looking forward to having that come out.
And people can pre-order that, right?
They can pre-order it through Brain Jar Press.
Yes, and you've got links to that on your blog.
I do,
so
in many places.
There it is again. Kathy is so good.
She's wonderful.
So, one more thing about your art I wanted to throw out.
Yes.
Your Daleks.
Yes.
You've got a whole thing of little sketches of different Dalek things you've done that I just fell in love with, being a bit of a Whovian.
Yes.
I just had to tell you that those were delightful. I had a note here. Didn't want to give it up.
Thank you so much. I really, again, that idea of mixing up made engineering with ridiculous fairy tale illustrations. I loved doing that project, and it is still going. So on my Patreon, I do occasionally drop in an extra Dalek or two, and once I've got a bit of a backlog, I'll do a refresh of the series on the blog. But just getting to play with that idea of those little drawings of just the panicky little voices and the way the world just seems to come at them so fast.
And you have been busy, though. I will say that because you've got Fly Away out, you got Travelogues coming out. You just had a pin that you did just came out, like what, today or yesterday or something?
I think it's in the process of being sent out to backers. That was for one of Tansy Rayner Roberts' projects. Yes, a little castle pin.
And you did portraits of the winners of the Queensland Literary Awards, which just got awarded.
Yes, last
this
Friday.
Week. Yeah, last Friday. So you're like everywhere.
It's probably oversaturating. Still got more coming out this year. Angela Slater's got a new collection coming out, Tallow Wife, which follows on from Bitterwood Bible and Sourdough. And I sketched through that. I've been working on the illustrations for some Juliette Marillier fairy tales, which is very exciting. The beauty of books is that they come out and people think, oh gosh, you've been really busy right now. And it's like, no, I was really busy quite a while ago. And I've just not been allowed to talk about it for ages. And a couple more short stories coming out this year. So it's been very exciting, and has definitely helped to keep me occupied this year.
That's good. It's good to be occupied. Well, we're pretty much out of time, I think. I think it's about time to roll up the tent. I just want to thank you so much. This was so much fun to see you again and to talk. And the books and the art are great. People, you should find them, order them, read them, buy them, spend your money.
Yes.
And Kathleen, yep, there is Fly Away. Hold it up.
Hold them up again.
Pop them up, Kathy. There we go. Great book. And so I want to thank you for taking tomorrow morning in Brisbane, and taking the time to talk with us out of your busy schedule. And from all of us here,
thank you so much.
Well, thank you. From all of us here at Fast Forward is Mike Zipser. Take care, stay safe, wash your damn hands.